behalf of David and I, we're very pleased to be here to present in this session today. So we've heard quite a lot in today's session, and certainly over yesterday as well, about these new types of mobility services, so on-demand, autonomous vehicles, mobility as a service. So what we thought today, rather than bombard you with a lot of slides, is that we might just continue that conversation. So I am going to start with a couple of slides just to let you know who Keolis Downer is, and most people already know. Have you got that? Fantastic. So as you heard from Steve Schofield earlier, Downer is an integrated services provider in Australia and New Zealand. Keolis, our other parent, is a global provider of transport. And it's important to note that certainly in the Keolis business, the new mobilities that we talk about in Australia are not new. So we deliver over 3 million demand responsive trips every year in our networks in Europe. And we've had autonomous vehicles in Europe for a number of years now. In Australia, and I'm sure no surprise again to anyone in the room, so we deliver bus, light rail and tram services across the country. And next slide. Fantastic. And in the new mobility space, we're delivering on-demand transport models in a number of states again, and also autonomous vehicles. Okay, and I'll just hand over to David, who will tell you a little bit about VIA.
Great. Thanks, Sue. So, as Sue mentioned, I am with the... Turn off. There we go. With VIA. And for those of you who are not familiar with VIA, VIA is the first company actually in the world started specifically for on-demand transit or on-demand shared ride, and we're still by far the largest company providing that technology. So we were started back in 2013 in New York, which is where we are based today, and built the technology to aggregate riders who are heading in the same direction into a single vehicle and then route that vehicle efficiently through a city. And so what that means is that you're giving each individual rider an experience that is similar to a private, having a private ride, but at a cost that is more comparable to public transit pricing. So when we started, as I mentioned, we started in New York with our own consumer business, but the idea from day one was not just to have our own direct-to-consumer business that we set up and we operate around the world, but rather that we partner and that we license our technology to public transit agencies and to operators to really help them use technology to make their services more efficient. And so that here is our mission here is to power the world's most efficient shared rides for cities, agencies, and private operators. And we firmly believe that by doing that and by giving our technology to these operators and to these cities, that we can work together to fight, we think, one of the biggest challenges in our cities, which is the single occupancy vehicle, right? So making public transit more attractive to people who would otherwise take their own cars. So here is a map of where we're operating today. So as I mentioned, we started in New York. Our own consumer business is live in New York, Chicago, DC, and then in Europe, in London and Amsterdam. In Europe, it's actually called VIA Van as opposed to VIA because we have a joint venture with Mercedes-Benz, who is actually VIA's largest investor. So the joint venture is called VIA Van. And then the dark blue cities are the cities that we operate in partnership with cities, transit operators, et cetera. So down in this part of the world, we have with Keolis Downer in Sydney and in Newcastle, the Keolisride service in Sydney and Newcastle On Demand in Newcastle. And then in New Zealand with GoBus in Queenstown. And we recently won the Auckland Transport tender, so we'll be operating starting next month in Auckland, New Zealand as well. But as you can see, there's a big range of cities, from very small cities up to large cities like Singapore, Tokyo, Los Angeles, et cetera. And we'll get more into that in a minute. Now, when we work with cities, we don't just provide the technology. Obviously, the technology is really our main differentiator and what we have spent a lot of time, a lot of resources building. But we also, in the algorithm, which is, as mentioned, powers the routing and the matching of riders to vehicles, But really another key piece of this is the expertise and the operational and marketing and all the support that goes around with this. So every city is unique, every city has unique challenges, every city has slightly different needs, and we are able to customize the technology to meet those cities' needs, but then also work very closely with the cities to apply all the best practices from our other deployments around the world to make the city successful. So that is kind of the platform that we'll provide to our partners. And then lastly, just a quick overview of how the service actually works. I think most of you have probably taken on-demand in various cities, but the rider requests a ride in the app, whether it's a VIA branded app or the partner's branded app. So for example, the Keolisride app in Sydney, the algorithm within a second or two assigns that rider to the most optimal seat in the network. The rider walks to a virtual bus stop, so we patented the technology behind the virtual bus stop where somebody walks to a nearby corner, which means that the vehicle can keep going in a straight line. That ride is shared, and again, in our mission, we talked about shared rides. It's really critical for us that these rides be shared rides as opposed to private rides. So you're sharing that ride with riders who are heading the same direction, and then that vehicle is being routed dynamically through a city as opposed to following any fixed routes or any fixed schedules. So with that, we thought we would mix it up a little bit. And so rather than just having some slides, what Sue and I are going to do now is have a little bit of a Q&A where we'll ask each other a few questions and just kind of make it a little bit more of a dialogue. So.
Great. So thank you, David. So we've had a lot of discussion today about on-demand and the drivers for it in terms of growing populations and creating better and more livable cities. But there's also the other side of the spectrum on-demand. So is it for everybody? Is it just for the tech-savvy? Is it just for big cities? Where do you see the application of on-demand transport working?
Yeah, so that's probably one of the questions that I get asked the most often, and it's interesting because we've been surprised over the last few years by the scale of the diversity or extent of the diversity in our ridership, and diversity across all dimensions. And so you have diversity in age, for example. One of the most passionate rider groups in our services, both in our consumer services and our partner services, are actually older riders. They like the convenience of having the vehicle come pick them up either at their front door or at a nearby corner. They also like the social aspect of being able to have conversations with folks in the vehicle with them. But then for us, because of the model of partnering, we have to work directly with cities and transit authorities, and the transit authorities, it's core to their model, right, to have accessibility, social inclusion, and so we also have adapted that into our technology. So things like wheelchair accessible vehicles, cash payment if you don't have a credit card, paying with cash, and making the price point affordable so that it's not just the wealthy, but also pretty much anybody can ride just like in public transit. And the last thing I'll say is that there's also diversity in terms of the types of cities, and so it's not just big cities like Tokyo or Singapore, or very small cities like New Zealand that can benefit from this. Really, everything from small cities to big cities have seen the model of on-demand transit work for them in various use cases and various situations. So really not just a service for the tech-savvy, not just a service for the young, not just a service for dense cities. Really, we've seen it applied well across the board. So now I'll ask Sue, maybe tell us a little bit about the goals that Keolis Downer and Transport. We heard a little bit from John Karaboulos about what Transport's been doing, but curious to hear what Keolis Downer and Transport have been looking to get out of these on-demand services.
Yeah, and it's important to start with for Keolis Downer is that we start at looking at, in new mobilities, how we have to actually optimize the service. So how do we provide a better outcome for our client and for the network, but also for our customers. So from that, we look at a lot of things around first and last mile connections, and we look at lines that are poorly patronaged, and that's what brings us to on-demand. So certainly the things that we test in on-demand and the things that we're learning, and we're really quite fortunate at Keolis Downer because we have a number of models. So we have a model, a Delegates model that's been operating in South Australia for many years. So it's not tech-enabled, but still quite successful. And we have our Newcastle model, which is part of our integrated contract. And we also have two as part of the on-demand pilots, so one on Northern Beaches and one at Macquarie Park. And all of these services are very different So they use different vehicle types, they operate different hours, they work in different demographics. So very, very different. So what we're trying to learn is one, what drives efficiency? And for us, the technology drives efficiency in terms of number of patronage, but also the back-end operations. So how do you optimise your business? And there's a big part that technology plays in that people don't necessarily talk about too much. Also, the customer experience. So for us, when we started, and particularly with the two on-demand pilots in New South Wales, and we were out in the community talking about the model, the first thing when we explained the model to people, they would say, like Uber, because of the technology. And what we would say is, no, you pay and book, similar to Uber, but these are public transport services. So we need them to have more characteristics that are closer to public transport than we do to private transport. So it's very much about optimising trips and having shared mobility. So in the customer space, what we're trying to learn is, what are the tolerances for customers? How far will they walk? How far will they wait? How do they work together on the vehicle? And it's interesting, David's experience overseas, where people like to chat. It's not always true in Australia. So what size vehicles are you using, and all of those things? And the feedback we get very clearly from customers is, certainly, the technology needs to work well, and it needs to be adaptable, and it needs to be responsive. But it's not unlike all the measures we get back for traditional transport, which is cleanliness of the vehicles, reliability of the service, quality of the drivers. So they're very much the things that we're learning. And the other part to that is, how do we deliver these services? So, what is the financial model? What is the contractual model? How do we partner with PTAs in a way to deliver these services? There is no point switching to these types of services for optimisations if we're just going to have empty vehicles. There is really no difference having a full-size bus running around with no one on it to having on-demand trams running around with no people in them. So what does that new model look like, and how do we start to shape it? And not just from the government's perspective or the government side either, but as operators from our side. And it can be a bit scary, I think, looking at these new contractual arrangements and different ways of actually doing business. But I think if we want to be successful in this space, then sort of that's territory we're going to have to charter.
Great. And so you mentioned, Northern Beaches, Macquarie Park, and Newcastle, which are three very different areas. Maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of the value that you've seen for the riders and how things are maybe a little bit different in those three situations.
Yeah, sure. And maybe start with Northern Beaches. So not sure if everyone's aware of Northern Beaches, New South Wales. So outside the city, north, probably 20-ish kilometres from the CBD. But a really interesting community. So lots of people commuting to the city every day. And our model opened on the day the B-line, as John talked about, the high-frequency bus, to support the B-line. So what we do on the Northern Beaches is we bring people into one of three B-line stops, or we pick them up from one of three B-line stops and we take them back out into the service zone. But it's an interesting community because you have, a really high population of people who are working in sort of knowledge jobs in the city and commute in the morning. But certainly in the community, it's a high residential community too. So lots of aged care facilities, lots of retirement villages. So it's a very mixed demographic. And what we've found very much there is that there's acceptance across all of those people. And technology isn't a barrier. We don't take cash on that model. It really hasn't proved to be a barrier. And patronage grows consistently because of that. So because we don't just have to rely on the commuter in the morning, but because we can build patronage through all parts of the day. And then on the weekends, we have all people coming in to enjoy the fantastic beaches on the Northern Beaches. So the learning there is that this can be, a sustainable model for the whole of the community. At Macquarie Park, we have different service. It's really built around people coming into work at the precinct. And again, very different because we pick up anywhere in the service zone and we take into anywhere within the central precinct. So we see with that model, typically we're shifting people out of cars So people who would have otherwise driven because there's not necessarily a good transport option for them are really becoming Keoride customers. And then again, in our model in Newcastle, we run the service in the middle of the day. And so we find it's very successful, and people really like the flexibility, the ability to be able to travel when they want, where they want, without having to sort of to rely on a fixed route bus. So David, just a little bit then about, I guess, lots of discussions around different models and what we've learned, and certainly people in this room are also running pilots, but where do you see the future of on-demand?
Yeah, I think I can honestly say now I've been at VIA for a year and a half, and I have never been more enthusiastic and more optimistic about the future for on-demand than today. When I first started the company, we had a couple pilots going on in a few cities, and fast forward about a year and a half now, we're launching a new city every week or two. And not only are we opening up new cities, but the cities that we're working with that have already launched, for the most part, are seeing rapid growth and are looking at expanding the service. And I think that's the key to this, is that, as John mentioned and as Sue mentioned, there's a lot of learning, right? There's a lot to be learned. This is a new model for a lot of cities. It's a new experience for riders. And so by starting small, by starting with a pilot in a defined area, the cities are able to then get those insights and figure out what's working, figure out what needs to be tweaked, and expand it from there. So I think, just like Sue was saying in Macquarie Park and in the northern beaches, we're getting cars off the street, we're getting driving people to public transit. I think one of the things that's frustrating to me when I hear some public transit agencies say, well, can this compete with public transit? And what we say is this, especially in the US, but I know in Australia also, there's a challenge of clogged streets and not enough people taking public transit to work, right? And it's in mode share in the teens in most cities in Australia. Sydney, it's in the 20s. But the question should not be, how do we protect that 15 or 20% and prevent it from going to 18%? The question should be, how can we get the 15 or 18% up to 50, 60, 80% taking public transit, right? How can we make public transit more convenient to everybody and more attractive relative to taking a personal vehicle? And that's where on-demand is coming in, and that's where we've seen in all these models around the world that by supplementing public transit, in some cases replacing some underperforming public transit, you're able to provide a great experience to the rider and able to entice them out of their car. And so we're very encouraged by what we've seen, and think both in Australia and around the world that this is a model that will continue to grow.
Okay, and thanks, and I guess we just wraps up our presentation, but something just to reflect on, and something I would like to leave you with, is that we're building a marketplace for on-demand. So it's been really wonderful to see the collaboration across operators, certainly in New South Wales, and not just because John's in the room, but the New South Wales, Transport for New South Wales has done a really great job in sort of bringing operators together so you can share the learnings. So I think, we really need to, if operators, if we see value in this space, and, I think we certainly do, that continued collaboration and shared learning so that we can build a marketplace where we can all play successfully.
Great. Thank you.